Well, thank you very much, Dr. Westreet. I'm really humbled by your introduction, and I really appreciate that there are a few people who've read my works. Few, but mighty. This is an extraordinary occasion. First of all, your Beatitude, Metropolitan Tikhon, it is such a great honor to have you present at the opening of this exhibit. In particular, because you remind us of the tragic side of the events of 1917 to 1921, the extended period of crisis of the Russian Revolution. And to have you honor with your presence the beginning of this year-long commemoration, far from a celebration, but a commemoration of the Russian Revolution, certainly one of the most important events in world history, will always remind us to keep the individual and the human side of these events foremost in our mind. On behalf of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and especially the Russian Area Studies program, which I helped to found almost 25 years ago, I would like also to thank Father Peter Donahue, our president, Dr. Majidi, our provost, for being here, and also to Millicent Gaskell, University Librarian, and all the many people at the library, especially Michael Foy, who are responsible for putting together this extraordinary exhibit. I was just dazzled when I walked into the library. I've walked into this library probably 1 million times since I arrived here 30 years ago, and I was just dumbfounded by the eloquence of these exhibits, which capture both the excitement, the vivid personalities, and also the tragedy of the Russian Revolution. Finally, I would like to recognize one of the most unassuming and humble men I know, Father Joseph Loya, director of the Russian Area Studies program. He deserves enormous credit and invested, fortunately not blood, but a lot of heart and soul into this exhibit and the year of events which will continue as Villanova marks the 100 years since the Russian Revolution. So I've been asked to make some brief remarks, and the students and former students among you know that when you ask a professor to make brief remarks, you really present that professor with a very big challenge. So I will genuinely try to keep them very brief. I have spent a lifetime of scholarly research into the Russian Revolution ever since I actually began studying Russian language as a high school student. People sometimes ask me, how did you, with a name like Adele Lindenmeyer, how did you get interested in Russia? And I just chose to take Russian language in my high school because it was different. I actually was taught, both in high school and in college, by a number of first and second generation Russian refugees from the revolution, and I think of them fondly today as reminders to me of the long, long reach of the Russian Revolution, that people who had experienced it directly or through their families ended up in a public high school in Connecticut teaching callow youths like myself the glories of the Russian language and literature. For me, then, this event has tremendous resonance, both personally and academically and intellectually. But one might ask whether this revolution of 100 years ago is really relevant in the post-Soviet world. Or one could challenge us by arguing that it is not appropriate to mark the anniversary of an event that cost so much in lives. And just to give you one very brief snapshot of the enormous human cost of the revolution, I will tell you briefly about the family of Nikolai Ostrov, whom I learned about in the course of my research on the life of one of the most prominent women of the Russian Revolution, Countess Sofia Panina. Nikolai Ostrov, who had been mayor of Moscow briefly in 1917, fled the city with Countess Panina in August of 1917 to avoid arrest by the Soviet authorities for his counter-revolutionary activity. He spent the Civil War in South Russia with the White Army. General Denikin. Is Denikin here? Would Denikin raise his hand, please? Yes. Denikin is the man with the attractive goatee there, General Anton Denikin, head of the volunteer army of South Russia. But Nikolai Ostrov, Nikolai Ivanovich left his three brothers, his elderly stepmother, and his brothers' families back in Moscow. In September of 1919, the Cheka, the political police of the Soviet state, uncovered the underground conspiracy of which Nikolai Ivanovich had been part in Moscow and arrested 67 people. Among them were Nikolai's two brothers, Vladimir and Alexander, his elderly stepmother, Yulia Mikhailovna, and his young 16-year-old nephew, Boris. His remaining brother, Pavel, managed to escape. The Cheka shot Vladimir, Alexander, and 16-year-old Boris, imprisoned Yulia Mikhailovna at her advanced age for many months, and Pavel, who fled with his family toward South Russia in order to join Nikolai Ivanovich, perished in the typhus epidemic that cost millions of lives of Russians in 1917 and in the Civil War. So in that one family, the cost was enormous in life and in hope. For the people who experienced it then, and for those of us who think historically and empathetically, this was an enormously important event. But as I said, is it really important to us today other than its historical interest? So I'm going to try today to explain briefly why I think the Russian revolutions of 1917 continue to have great significance for Russian history and for modern world history, and suggest why for the contemporary world this is an event worth commemorating and seeking to understand as well. In assessing the significance of 1917 for Russia, for Russian history, we need to distinguish between the two revolutions, which will form the twin pillars, if you will, of Villanova's commemoration this year. In February, virtually the entire Russian nation celebrated the fall of the monarchy and the dismemberment of the old regime, whose incompetence and obsolescence had become especially apparent during the Great War. The first revolution, which began on Women's Day in February of 1917, ignited hopes for democracy, equality, and emancipation. A dizzyingly rapid series of changes took place in the short 8 months between the revolutions. Legal estates were abolished, women and minorities gained full political rights, and the spirit of renewal affected every political, social, and cultural institution in the country in the spring and summer of 1917. By the autumn of 1917, however, that atmosphere of hope, excitement, anticipation, renewal had turned to anger, impatience, and fear. You don't have enough time for me to explain why, so I will just suggest to you maybe taking a Russian history course or picking up one of those books that fill this wonderful library. By the fall of 1917, Russians talked openly of civil war, even before a tiny band of extreme radicals, the Bolsheviks, easily overthrew the temporary government in late October. That climate of fear and rage and class hatred should not obscure, in my view, the other side of the October Revolution, the utopian dreams it also generated for the liberation of all humanity. We see the reflection of these utopian revolutionary dreams in the rich artistic and literary legacy produced by the October Revolution, for example. And it is that mix of fear and utopian hope that colored the way the rest of the world outside Russia received the socialist revolution of October, both at the time and for most of the 20th century. That revolution generated a deep and lasting fear of the Soviet state and a socialist system that repudiated religion, private property, and the rules of diplomacy and international relations. After all, the Bolsheviks and their great October Socialist Revolution proclaimed the liberation not just of Russia, but of all humanity, and aggressively promoted their mission of spreading revolutionary ideology around the world. For people of my generation who were raised during the Cold War, and yes, I did duck and cover in first grade, that revolutionary international mission retained its salience even after the Soviet system itself, in the post-World War II period, had become rather decrepit and rigid. At the same time, the utopian hopes ignited by the October Revolution in Russia resonated around the world, both in the shattered countries of post-World War I Europe and lands still under European colonial domination after the end of the Great War. The October Revolution turned into a beacon for movements to end political oppression, overthrow imperial subjugation, equalize human relations, and humanize education and social institutions. The example of the Soviet Union, as well as its financial support, inspired national liberation movements, as well as individual experiments in the radical restructuring of social life, family institutions, art, and literature. In short, it is, in my opinion, impossible to write the history of the 20th century without acknowledging the reverberations, the enormous impact of the Russian Revolution around the globe. But here we are, more than 25 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, and I dare say very few students, even in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, study Marxism anymore, a political ideology, as well as a philosophical school that seems to have lost its resonance and its relevance. So is the Russian Revolution significant today? And if so, how? I do have my own answers to that question, but it is the intention of the Russian Area Studies faculty to invite each member of the Villanova community to pose that question for themselves and to find their own answers, we hope with the help of this exhibit and with the help of the events that we've planned for this semester and for the fall of 1917. So I invite you to reflect, to learn more if you wish, and to also think about the historical reverberations of an event that shaped so much of 20th century history today. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm so pleased to welcome you here to Villanova.
Your Beatitude, please come forward. On behalf of His Beatitude, he'd like to present to Father Peter and to the members, to Dean Adele Lindenmeyer, and the esteemed members of the library, the director, Michael Foyt, and them. He is going to present you with something to remember this day. It is made from Siberian rock crystal. It's not the Chinese kind that you can buy in a little store, but these are real rock crystal, and they are the imperial crown of Catherine the Great and Nicholas II, the initial of the Tsar, the last Tsar of Russia, etched from 4 different angles in a modern Russian setting. This came from Russia, and it was brought, and he will present to each one. Father Peter. Dean. Vladika. The other members of the library, the director, please, and the provost.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very beautiful. Michael, I have a special gift for you, Michael, but it'll be given to you later. I have been kidding
Father
Michael
John.
all along that he reminds me of the great Russian poet Pushkin. So when we go into the reception, don't believe this, it's true though, I had from Russia a t-shirt made of Pushkin dressed like Michael. Please, the other members, Joanne Quinn, please. Is Joanne here? Please. Joanne helped us tremendously. And Laura? Is Laura here? Okay, please accept one for Laura. Joanne was working with us with the graphics. She had to put up with myself through this whole exhibit, so she deserves more than one of these. We have, and take for Laura. For Laura.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I thank you, Vladika, very much. Thank you.